Be sure to check out our free InfoSec Day, March 3rd or March 5th. Please ask us for an invitation if you don't already have one. Everyone's invited.
My shout out today goes to Joe and Jane. You can see them here. I guess they found out that we have reserved the venue for 2020 InfoTex Jam, and they wanted to camp out for it. Somebody really needs to let them know that the jam isn't until July of 2020. I really don't think they need to be camping out this far in advance.
Dan, you do realize that Joe and Jane are cartoon characters,
what?
Right?
Are you sure? I mean, just so you know, Mike, these are my guitars. Actually, that's my friend Al's guitar. But that's my, this right here is my acoustic bass. This is my 12-string. That's my Taylor. I'm really proud of that guitar.
It's a cartoon with a picture of your guitars in it.
All right, well, okay. Well, good to know.
Coming to a theater in Lafayette, Indiana on July 24th, 2020. The InfoTex Jam. Only mark your calendars if you like having fun. Email us to register. Everybody is welcome.
Oh, hi, Dan Hadaway here, playing harmonica in beautiful Grand Canyon. Not really, which is kind of brings us to our You Spoke, We Listened initiative here in 2020. We actually took a lot of feedback from clients and regular webinar attendees throughout the year of 2019. And boiled everything down to 7 different suggestions, 6 of which we can make work, and we're putting into action right now. Starting with the fact that I wasn't in front of the Grand Canyon, I was in front of a green screen. Though we started off recording webinars and posting them as movies, we're now actually recording movies and posting them as webinars. And so the first suggestion that a few of you made was just call it a movie. All right, we're doing that. This is a movie. We aren't actually there. The second suggestion kind of relates to the first suggestion, in our opinion, is if we're going to show a movie, maybe we can have a panel discussion after the movie. The third and probably the most important suggestion that we're going to implement is to get a regular schedule and stick to it. And that came actually after our webinar that we canceled the first time, and then we actually had to cancel a second webinar, which, by the way, shouldn't happen anymore because they're pre-recorded movies, right? And then, of course, the 2 suggestions that most of you gave us was, A, make them shorter, which this one would be a lot shorter if I didn't have this You Spoke, We Listened section at the beginning of it, but we're definitely there. We are going to come out with a series of webinar shorts where we try to keep them to 20 minutes in length, and we'll identify those on our on webinars.infotex.com as shorts. And then the last suggestion is the one we couldn't implement, which is move the legal disclaimers to the end of the webinar. And that kind of helped us realize, I bet, after watching the second or third webinar, that gets kind of old. But we still want to leave the legal disclaimers at the beginning of the webinar. And the reason why is because not everybody is a regular webinar attendee like you, right? Some people are here for the first time, and they need to know the limits and the weaknesses with our education strategy. And so because of that, we can't move the legal disclaimers to the end. With that, I think I'll just kind of return to our regularly scheduled legal disclaimer. Thanks for joining us.
Our lawyers want you to know that when you attend any of our webinars or watch any of our movies, you're agreeing to the terms of service located at the link on the screen. We're also required to provide this abbreviation of what our terms of service include. The main point we need to get across is that regulations change on a regular basis, and we want you to know that what we present can sometimes be very time-dated information or our own interpretation of new guidance or regulations. The materials we present today are subject to change. Also, whenever we provide free boilerplates as part of our webinars or movies, we're required to point out our transfer of copyright agreement, which is also located on our website in our IT resources library. You can read it by going to the link on the screen. Please also note, by attending an InfoTex webinar or by receiving any InfoTex movie, you may be added to our mailing list. We apologize if you'd rather not receive notice of other free education. You can always opt out at the link on the screen. And one last thing before we introduce our moderator, Michael Hartke. We'll be initiating a survey directly after the webinar, and we ask you to take a minute to fill it out. We would really appreciate it. And now, it is our pleasure to introduce to you our webinar moderator, the code curator and special envoy from the SIEM, Michael Hartke.
Thanks for the introduction, and welcome everybody. I'm very proud to introduce our webinar for February, what the CAT seems to be, how the typical SIEM helps smaller community-based banks comply with the FFIC Cybersecurity Assessment Tool. I would like to jump right in and announce our webinar presenter, the man with 13 letters after his name, the compliance guru from Indiana. Some say he's a dog man, but this is one cat he understands. Dan Hadaway. Dan?
Well, thanks a lot, Mike. Appreciate that introduction. I always love Mike's introductions. And welcome, everybody. Before we really get started, I'd like to do my monthly shout out. And this month's shout out goes to an employee here at Infotex, Brian Bunnell. For a few years now, he's been our keeper of the sacred scrolls, which means that he's responsible for organizing and maintaining our boilerplate library and the checklists we use for audits and that sort of thing. But recently, he's had a new role added to his job description because unbeknownst to Brian, when he did some reviews of our movies, he came up with some really good ideas on how to improve them. Seemed to be insistent that we do the right thing to make them good movies. He actually made me totally redo January's movie. I actually had to do January's movie twice. And so we're now calling Brian our director. And we definitely appreciate his hard work. We definitely appreciate, the fact that he gets to yell cut, he gets to yell action, and probably most importantly and most meaningful to me is he's the guy that gets to make me do more work if necessary in order to improve the qualities of our webinars. So thank you very much wherever you are, Brian. One other thing I'd like to do is to go through a couple disclosures before we start today. We are a managed security service provider, and a lot of what we're going to be talking about today really relates to what we do for our clients. And so it's important that you realize that there are other legitimate players in the industry. And while they should agree with most of what we're saying in general, they may take a different approach towards offering services that might get you to the same destination. And so because we only know our SIEM, would like to say that we've analyzed other SIEMs, we have, but we don't really know exactly how they work. And so what we've decided to do today is just to tell you what our SIEM does. You're going to have to translate that back to your SIEM if you're using somebody besides Infotex. Also, in almost every case, the CAT statement's compliance requires you to do something. And so we're going to talk about where your managed security service provider covers a CAT statement. But know that you still usually have to do something even when your MSSP is covering a CAT statement. But what we want to talk about today is how the SIEM that Infotex provides helps smaller banks comply with the Cybersecurity Assessment Tool. And so the way we'll do that is by starting off talking about the CAT itself, and then we'll talk a little bit about our SIEM, but then this will be our first panel discussion webinar. And so obviously you're watching a movie right now, but after this movie, hang out because I'm going to bring in a few people that will discuss certain issues related to how the SIEM helps us comply with the Cybersecurity Assessment Tool. And so, how about we go ahead and get started? Okay, so let's just kind of talk about the cat here. First of all, I'd just like to point out to you that the kitty cat there is my NOC manager, Chad Smith's cat Margaret. Margaret became the mascot for InfoTex's CAT tool, which is the tool that we made available. It's a spreadsheet we made available way back in 2015 that addressed the new guidance that was voluntary. We all remember it being voluntary, right? And hopefully you recognize this iconography here. It set up 5 different domains from a maturity perspective. It helped us go through an inherent risk assessment so we can determine, how mature we really should be. Most of our clients are falling into this category here where, you're at minimal inherent risk. And so you think, hey, as long as I'm at baseline, I'm okay. But what I want to make sure you realize is that you still probably have a little work left, and eventually your examiners might be getting around to asking you why you're not at evolving. And so just know that you can start moving towards evolving, at least in the areas where you are outsourcing to a managed security service provider. But I would start laying the paper trail to answer that question now. In other words, why aren't we at evolving? There might be good reasons. If we can be ready to answer that question before the examiners ask it, we might get ourselves out of some compliance objectives that we feel don't absolutely contribute to security. Now, our cybersecurity assessment tool was published, a few months after the original guidance was released, and then we updated it when they came out with version 2 of the guidance. But what we did is we looked at maturity statement by statement instead of at a component level. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to lay a paper trail that allowed us to prioritize mitigation based on our own perceived risk. And we wanted to do that at the statement level rather than at the component level. The tool really, not only did it give us the ability to then manage mitigation at the statement level, but it also gave us the ability to analyze a cybersecurity assessment tool, which really ended up resulting in this webinar, because when we analyze the tool and when we analyze really the maturity statements, we started realizing, holy cow, we actually contribute as a managed security service provider to the compliance of a lot of statements that smaller community-based banks, way back in 2015 at least, were not yet in compliance with. And so let's just kind of take a quick look at our cybersecurity assessment tool for those of you who didn't use it, just to kind of help you get familiar with what we're talking about here. You'll see that, we've actually numbered each of the statements. We've broken them down, but if we was to look at, columns that I have hidden here, and I can unhide those real quick for you, you'll see that they each tie back to the component. And so the main thing to know is that in order to be in compliance with the oversight component, you need to have all of these statements. In order to be at baseline, you actually need to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 statements done. And so most of our clients now are at a baseline level. But between 2015 and now, over the last 5 years, they really couldn't claim baseline on the oversight component until they had all 5 of these statements in place. Makes sense? And so I'm just going to undo the hiding of the columns, because I have this kind of conveniently reduced down to what we need to do today. But the way this worked is then our clients would look at each of these statements, and there's some columns in here. You can see there's a lot of columns hidden over here where they would analyze the statement. They would declare what level of maturity they were at and that sort of thing. And, the rest is history, and we're way past that. But the reason we're circling back around to the tool now is because we have analyzed this tool in terms of what we cover as a managed security service provider, what we help with, what we can help with, that sort of thing, which is what the rest of this webinar is going to be about. So let's kind of return to the webinar now. Okay, well, Sophia, I love that transition here, but let's kind of talk about the SIEM now. And so what happened in 2015 and in 2016, and by 2017, everybody was getting it, they were loving it, but we ended up drawing a security monitoring architecture like this that basically, established that your managed services provider, through the use of IPS/IDS, event log management, change detection, etc., we're really helping cure a lot of these CAT statements. And if you look, what the tech team in a bank was doing before they engaged with their managed security service provider, they were not getting that many of the CAT statements, right? I mean, if you look at that, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 baseline statements that cured by what we were already doing, whereas there's a whole bunch of baseline statements that were cured by the managed security service provider. And our business just took off in 2015 as people started to realize that. Now, wait a minute here. There's something I'm supposed to remember.
Dan, don't forget. Be careful what you promise. Most of this still requires cooperation from the bank's technical team.
So I just remembered something. I want to make sure you realize that there is a mutual reliance between 3 different teams whenever a SIEM is involved. In other words, the way infotex define this, the way we define a SIEM is we say a SIEM is that which facilitates the mutual reliance between 3 teams in a bank. So I hope you understand what that means. What it basically means is that if we say we can, help you with a CAT statement, doesn't necessarily mean we're doing all of the work. What we've done when we analyze the Cybersecurity Assessment Tool from a, hey, what does the MSSP do perspective, first of all, there's a whole bunch of statements that we just simply don't help with, okay? So I'll talk to you about those in a minute here. And then there's a lot of statements that we or a typical managed security service provider can help with. But most of these are in the area of audit work or boilerplates. We offer a lot of boilerplates to our managed security service provider clients and that sort of thing. So while we can help with these statements, not necessarily part of our contract, it's not necessarily part of a typical MSSP contract, but know that if you're not working with infotex, your MSSP can probably help with the same statements that we're saying we can help with. And then there's statements that we do help with. In other words, hey, if you're engaged with us, we are actually actively helping with this particular statement, even though we're not really responsible for it. We still plug into it. And I'll explain what I mean, when we get into the analysis as well. And then finally, there are those statements where if you've engaged with us for a full SIEM, meaning that we're doing IPS, IDS, we're doing event log management, we're doing change detection, and then we're running all of those different sources, those different inputs into the database that most people call the SIEM. Again, we don't really call the database our SIEM. We call the overall process the Security Information and Event Management System. There are many statements that we actually cover, and we'll talk about those as well. What we need to make sure that we remember is that we cover with the help of our clients. Let's kind of take a look at the tool from that perspective. And what you'll find is that we're able to filter down to those 3 different categories. First of all, if you look at this here, and hopefully everybody can see this, okay, but, there's statements that there's nothing here, right? In other words, designating a member of management, holding that management accountable, sorry, but we really can't help there at all. That's what the board does, right? And so we're not going to be able to help hold management accountable. When it comes to the things we can help with, if you notice, if you filter down to just the ones in this column here, you'll see that, wow, our MSSP can help with a whole bunch of stuff just in domain 1. Now, if we kind of zoom in a little bit here, you know, I mean, the institution has board-approved policies, commensurate with risk, blah, 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 right? Well, how does InfoTex help with that? Well, if you're a managed security service provider of InfoTex's, we actually provide all of our boilerplates to you at no cost. So we can help with that. Does that make sense? And so there's a lot of, you know, statements like that where it's just our boilerplate that makes it. But, you know, there's still, you know, a formal process has a comprehensive set of policies. That's boilerplate. You know, I mean, if we get into the incident response testing, though, but, you know, you'll have to engage with us in order for us to help you, okay? And so that's what we mean by that. Let's go ahead and unfilter that column. And let's filter to the second column, which is the column we do help, just to kind of help you understand what mean there. And so here's a great example. There's only really one statement in the first domain where we do help. The reason why I say there's only one statement is because the first domain, you know, has only got one statement showing up when we filter down to we do help. And so prioritizing organizational assets. Now that's something that you've got to do. We don't do it for you. But during our tuning period, we're actually helping you create a paper trail as to what you're not going to watch using an organizational asset prioritization method. And so most of our clients are like, wow, hey, isn't this what the CAT required? Yes, it is. We'll go ahead and use this and submit this to our auditors to fulfill that requirement. So we do help you with that. It's still mostly your work, right? You still have to tell us which assets you want to watch, which ones you don't, etc. We help you with the prioritization by doing a little mini network criticality analysis. And just so you know, your examiners, your auditors might want you to go above and beyond what we're helping you do, but we do help with that particular statement. So that's just kind of an example. I mean, let's jump down here to, you know, I always like going into the fourth domain, or the fifth domain, because in the fifth domain we have a lot of incident response stuff, right? And so here's a good example. Scenarios are used to improve incident response detection, and you know, a lot of people are trying to interpret, well, what does that mean? What we're basically saying is that many of our clients use this to facilitate incident response testing. We actually include it in a lot of our managed security engagements. And the main reason why is because we've learned over the years the best way to prepare your team, not only reactively, but also preventively, is to do an incident response test. We feel like that really opens management eyes and that sort of thing. And so, again, you know, while you still do the work, we're not actually doing the test, right? But we can facilitate a test. We also have a lot of boilerplates surrounding the notion of incident response testing if you want to go ahead and facilitate your own. But our point being is that we do help with that by nature of us being engaged with our clients. Let's go ahead and unfilter that category now and bring up the final category, which is the we cover this. And this is really, you know, the value in you working with an MSSP is that you're able to cover a whole bunch of threat management type statements, a lot of the monitoring statements, you know, even some vendor management statements, and then definitely a lot of incident response statements, just by being engaged with your managed security service provider. And so all ports are monitored. We do that. If with our change detection system, we're scanning your ports on a periodic basis, all depending on whether you set it up daily, weekly, monthly, or quarterly. And then we're providing a report to you of any ports that have changed since the last time the report was run, right? Well, guess what? We do that. We cover that for you, but don't you have to receive that report? Don't you have to understand that report? Don't you have to acknowledge that, hey, yes, we changed that port on purpose, or can you give me more information about this port? I don't remember changing it, or whatever. The point being is, even though we cover it, you still are involved in the process, because a SIEM it's the interactive mutual reliance of three different teams: the tech team, your managed security service provider, and your incident response team. So let's go ahead and return to the webinar. Thanks for bearing with me. I know I've been showing you a spreadsheet a lot today, but what I wanted to make sure you know is that if you're attending the live webinar today, well, start thinking of questions, because one of the advantages of that is that you'll be able to ask our panel some questions. But then B, also know that Sophia should have already delivered our CAT tool to you so you can filter things down and see what we cover versus, what we do help with and what we can help with. But if you're watching the movie, you'll need to email us, and we'll be happy to provide that CAT tool to anybody. Whether you're a client of ours or not, we'll provide that tool to you. You can use it for whatever reasons you want, including understanding how your managed security service provider helps you comply with the Cybersecurity Assessment Tool. And so with that, we are ready now to end our webinar and actually start with the panel discussion.
Be sure to check out our movie on how to test your SIEM, located on movies.infotex.com.